And now, welcome to another edition of Discourse, the Early Studies Project podcast on current events and scandals and all sorts of things that we are seeing now in the world. My name is Sidney Castillo. I'm going to host this podcast. And with me, I have Sierra, Lawson, and Chris Cotter, also from the RSP. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, good to be back.
Yeah, indeed. After a long time, I mean, all this virtuality is still driving most of academic work, but at least we have video to show that we are alive and stuff.
Exactly.
So today we have different topics that we are going to discuss. Some of them are focused on the recent holidays I went through, namely Latin America. We know it as Holy Week or Semana Santa, which would be the equivalent of Easter for the rest of the world, English-speaking world, and also Passover in Judaism, as we're going to discuss one part, courtesy of Sierra. And then we will move on the discussion to two topics that are a little bit out of sight of this theme, but is related to controversies on public display of religious allegiance or prayer in a sports setting, and the other is one letter of a very angry viewer or a reader of a UK magazine about the program Derry Girls, which I don't know anything about, but I'm sure Chris will be kind to give us some context on that.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, just to briefly open the conversation. So, recently we had Holy Week, or as I mentioned, Semana Santa, we know it. And this week in Latin America that we commemorate or remember what is pretty much the entering of Jesus to Jerusalem and all of his parcours or walkthrough to the different events that are within the Bible, until his resurrection of Jesus, which is the cornerstones of belief and practice also in the Catholic ritual and Mass. And what happens in each day is it is not so much each day that happens something, but at least in observance, and a common mainstay in different Latin American countries is that we celebrate Palm Sunday, which is Domingo de Ramos in Spanish, and it symbolizes the entry of Jesus to Jerusalem. And we celebrate also Thursday and Friday, which usually Thursday is the day that we commemorate the Last Supper. And but actually the dietary restrictions or the different kind of food that you have to ingest is only reserved for Friday, because on Friday you're not supposed to eat any kind of flesh or red meat, because Jesus has died at the end of a very painful process, as we have we all know some way or the other. So you're not supposed to eat meat. And then you have Sábado de Gloria, or Saturday of Glory, as we call it, which is the vigil of the resurrection. And we are waiting for Jesus to manifest and resurrect. And finally, on Sunday, we have the Resurrection Sunday, where it's, of course, like a comeback triumph of Jesus from the dead. Nowadays, I think it's safe to say that in Latin America, and the last 25 years, so to speak, is this holiday, it hasn't had so much the religious tone or observance that people used to have it in the generations of my grandparents, for instance. People were more used to be more like quiet or keep to themselves or become more introspective, to have kind of deeper conversations, or totally commit to silence, especially in Friday when Jesus died. So it used to be like that, more solemn festivity, and people used to gather to watch a bunch of Bible movies from the 50s. I mean, everyone knows Ben-Hur with Charlton Heston and the Ten Commandments as well, and other famous movies of the period. But so the practice were really, Holy Week was really observed within the context of a family. And this was throughout Peru, I would say the least. Of course, in the coast or in the cities, big cities like Lima, is lived in a different way than in the rainforest part of Peru or also the Andes, because there are different ways for reenacting the Via Crucis, or the journey of Jesus from Judas' betrayal to his crucifixion. But more or less it's the same. Nowadays, last 25 years, as I mentioned, it has changed a lot. I mean, people are not so much religious or observe it as in a religious way, but more of a cultural Catholic way. So it's just an excuse to have holidays, and people are happy that it's holidays in the middle of April. So everyone is just eager to go out of the city or have a short trip to close by towns that you can see some of the folk traditions that are carried out there. And that's what I did as well. I live in Tarapoto in San Martin region of Peru, but I went to Lamas, which is the folklore capital of San Martin, this region. And because there's a substantial amount of people that are from the Quichua Lamista background, language, indigenous people. So they carry out more the folk traditions, so to speak. And they have their own way of eating foods on Friday. For instance, I ate this kind of chonta tree, which is like a palm tree that you eat only the core, and you are supposed to eat only that kind of vegetable throughout Friday. And I had different dishes with salad and a stew. That was quite nice. But in Ayacucho, which is on the southern Andes part of Peru, there's another important celebration that they have. It's actually the world's second most important Holy Week celebration. The first one is in Sevilla, Spain. They really have a lot of performances, folkloric performances, and also the procession of the Resurrection Sunday. It's quite impactful, so say the least, because it's a huge kind of how can I say, anda in Spanish is the name, chariot, or a kind of the effigy of Jesus that is resurrected is huge. It's it weighs over 500 kilos, and there has to be at least 100 people carrying it, and it's tall as I cannot remember, more than 10 meters. I have to show a picture of that, or I will attach a picture of that for the website. But it's quite impressive, and you're supposed to stay until 5-6 a.m. when the sunrise happens, and it symbolizes the resurrection of Jesus. And this effigy starts to become transported towards the main plaza of the town. So you can find these kind of celebrations throughout Latin America. It's quite common, but as I mentioned, people sometimes just go because of it's something that they identify themselves with as culturally rather than religiously. And I think this is a mainstream shift, especially for young adults, people from 20 to 35 years old nowadays. And but this is how more or less how people live whole week in Latin America, and Peru specifically. So that's one part of it.
Yeah, it got me thinking just about how localized tradition is, and I'm sure we could all start to, Sarah, in a US context, and myself in the UK could start listing off, oh, these things happen, these things don't happen. But a question I would have for you is how much, Easter, as I envisage it in the Scottish general landscape, is not very visible at all. It's much more visible to me, I suppose, A, with my religious studies scholar hat on, and B, one of the other hats I have is I get paid to sing in churches. So Easter Holy Week is a quite financially remunerative time for me, because there's a lot more singing. But apart from that, it's you suddenly in shops, Easter eggs absolutely everywhere. Easter bunny. And this year, for the first time ever, I noticed it was Easter because the Open University mandates that you have the Friday and the Monday off work, and that's just you have them off. So I took them off. But I've never had that in my life before. I've actually had a holiday around the time. So I just wondered how much of the chocolate and bunnies and stuff have you encountered in Latin America? And does that translate?
Yeah, I mean, the chocolate and the bunnies, I think they are ubiquitous. You cannot really avoid it because it's like part of marketing, and supermarkets also import a lot of Easter bunny chocolates. Some of them, of course, it's not a Peruvian thing or Latin American thing, but people consume it, and I think this will be more segmented in a way of class distinction, so to speak. So people actually can go to the supermarket and buy a Easter bunny egg or chocolate. They of course will do it, and they are more easy to find also in big urban centers or anywhere that has like kind of a supermarket or which this kind of product could reach. Even here, I mean, I live in Rainforest, but this is a city, Tarapoto, and there's one supermarket. Actually, there's like several different chains, but you can find Easter bunny paraphernalia and chocolates and stuff. I mean, people are not so. I mean, I would say that they do not consume this as much as in the Northern Hemisphere, I would say. Because when I was living in Budapest, in Hungary, they actually did consume a lot of Easter bunny. But in here it's not so much. And I would say that people that live in urban centers in Lima, people from middle class towards up, they will tend to consume more Easter bunny as well, or to do the game of finding the Easter bunny in the house. I only did that once in my life, and it was with a relative that had some money. I mean, lived in a fancy place in Lima, but not in my house, and so that's one part of it, I would say. Yeah, but it's much more localized, and people consume things that are from the place rather than.
I think I could have probably gone for about a decade living in Scotland without really noticing Easter at all. But when you've got children now, suddenly our living room is full of chocolate eggs. Everyone under the sun wants to buy them chocolate.
Yeah, I think like the celebrations in like Catholic dominant Latin American countries being so localized is just really interesting as well. Like, for instance, like the Corpus Christi that happens a little later this year in Cusco happens, along the same sort of calendar that the Inca Empire. So, that was the capital of Tawantinsuyo, which is the Inca Empire. So it's really interesting how localized elements, in the Catholic calendar run up against each other into modernity, and kind of what traditions get preserved and, how things adapt. And, that's also definitely defined by public processions that have an entirely different tone than, being in North Carolina right now. There is a significant, Catholic community, but the public demonstration of that Catholic identity is a little bit different than, say, Cusco or the Passion Plays in Mexico, or all the really interesting different localized elements we see in Latin America. So, I thought that was a really interesting example. I'm a little more familiar with different aspects of Holy Week in a colonial context, but it's always interesting to read about it in the contemporary too.
Yeah. And I only learned, I was this week years old when I learned that, the Orthodox Church Easter is this coming Sunday. And that mind blown. I just, assumed that was a universally agreed constant.
Yeah. Well, speaking of things we assume to be constant being a little bit contingent to things like calendars, which are, social constructs. This was such a flourishing week with religious traditions for us to talk about. And so I thought I'd bring in some perspectives on Passover. So I think especially living in North Carolina, it's really interesting to see how certain adaptations were made to Passover dinner. So my friend Justine Orlovsky-Schnitzler, she writes for Edith Magazine and, a few other venues sometimes. And she sent me over this post about Michael Twitty, who writes about African American, and African diasporic identity and food and being Black and Jewish. At the same time, I'm teaching a unit on being Black and Jewish for a Jewish studies class. And so, and I'm constantly thinking about how food is an extremely powerful metaphor for identity, and especially the Passover plate. For a long time in Judaism in the United States, there was a saying that, lesbians belong in Judaism like bread at the Seder plate. That's a way of kind of saying they don't belong because there's no leavened bread at the Seder plate. So I was just really interested in how people like Michael Twitty have been bringing Black soul food into their Seder meals and the different symbolisms that can line up with sort of traditional readings of, the metaphors associated with this food, but also make space for a little bit of a less narrow and possibly essentialized definition of what Jewish identity looks like represented through food. So, the same way there's no right way really to celebrate Semana Santa or Easter, right? There's no one way to be Catholic, as we'll talk about with Derry Girls, right? There's no sort of trans-historical necessary way to represent yourself in sort of that kind of meal. Of course, in traditional Judaism, you're not going to replace anything at the Seder plate. So this is, a very particular context we're talking about. So I just thought that was an interesting thing to teach with. And I think it was also quoting Rabbi Lawson, talking about, who I'm not related to at all, but discussing sort of her perspective in North Carolina on the making space for Judaism and Blackness and one identity. I don't know if that evoked any thoughts for you guys or...
Yeah, I know. I really enjoyed it. The first thing I would have to say is this is my Edinburgh first year religious studies. I think the course, I can't remember, it was called Lived Religions or something, the World Religions 101. And I think they did, various combinations, but the Judaism section it ended up being much more material focused than the Islam and Buddhism sections. They all had a very different kind of theoretical angle to them. And so the students just sort of came away with this idea that Jews love food. Jews love food, and because there was so much teaching material about Jews and food, and as the I guess tutor dealing with the mediating of the teaching material and the reading material, I was there. Everyone loves food. Atheists love food too, and so do Muslims. So just because the readings focused on Jewish food practices does not mean that Jews are uncharacteristically more obsessed with food than any other tradition, but they always came away with this oh yeah, Jews and food, it's just it's ingrained, isn't it? And no, it's a human practice. So that's something I have to make sure I get in there every time the topic of Judaism and food comes up.
It's such a fine line, I think, teaching about Judaism, where you're trying to undo this Protestant hegemony of the idea that religion is strictly interior belief, but you're also running up against the possibility that you might be essentializing Judaism as an earthly religion of the body. And so, you have to make space for all kinds of different critical dynamic thinking. But, I will say UNC is not a Jewish dominant school. And, I've run into similar issues where you're talking about dietary restrictions and you're talking about establishing a covenant with God and circumcision, and they kind of get this weird perspective that you're not trying to reinforce by talking about the body, yet because of dominant discourses in the United States on what religion looks like, you might end up overcorrecting at times, if that makes sense. But yeah, so that's always a risk, right?
Absolutely. I also. Again with the church singing, so the and I'm not a practicing anything, but the church that I was singing at on Monday, Thursday decided to stage a Seder meal as part of the service, and it was a very interesting. I mean, it was lovely, and people participated and had a good time, but they obviously added in various Christian interpretations into things whilst also seemingly following a fairly traditional script at the same time, but then added in a few extra little bits, and I was definitely sitting there with my ethnographer hat on going, I wonder where this repurposing came from. Is it idiosyncratic to the minister here, or is it a sort of broader thing? But it was nice. But again, also felt a little bit like appropriation at the same time.
I think there's been cases of like Jewish communities not being able to buy matzah because Christian communities in the US, I saw, a few experiences posted of increasing. I think it's not idiosyncratic to that space. I would say it's a broadening. As popular as gender reveals are becoming, this is apparently becoming something popular in a particular Christian space. So
Sydney, I don't know if you. I mean, I don't know. I don't have anything particularly on. It was just interesting to see the repurposing and reimagining of things, but also that will have always been the case from the first time the ritual was instantiated in any shape or form. There will have been those localized cultural elements, and these things take on the flavors of the cultures within which they take place.
Exactly. Yeah, I one comment of the Michael Tweety that I read is like he equiparates me, because you're supposed to reflect when people are at the Passover meal and having the Seder plate. You're supposed to reflect on the struggle or narrate the struggle of the tale of Exodus. And he equiparated this as the struggle also of Black African Americans in the United States, and how they were brought from the slave trade to the New World. And so this was an interesting parallelism, and it speaks of how, well, tradition, of course, as we know, it's never something that is fixed, but rather it's quite dynamic, and it's re-semanticized by the people that lived it in everyday life. And this is one perfect example of that. And that came to mind, and I immediately was drawn to my Michel Sartor readings back from my first explorations in social theory and religious studies theory. But that was quite a nice read, and also the plates really look tasty. So I might want. I mean, I never tried what they call soul food, but this kind of way of cooking. It sounded very similar to what we in Peru here also eat. With a lot of spices, or sometimes you eat fried foods, deep fried foods. It depends where you are as well. And they sounded quite tasty. So I might try them cooking. Maybe I won't be successful, but the taste is just like the spices that they use is quite similar to what we use here. So that's nice.
Absolutely. Well, I'm just keeping an eye on the time. We should probably keep pressing on. So my story is not, the first one's not from a UK context. It is from a US context, and I have to thank Daniel Jones on Facebook for having shared this story. But it's about the US Supreme Court on the 25th of April, so 4 days after we're recording, are taking on a case where there's a high school American football coach from Bremerton High School, just west of Seattle, named Joe Kennedy. And this dates back to 2015, so the case is just coming to the Supreme Court on the 25th of April. And for 6 seasons, this coach had been saying a prayer on the 50-yard line at the end of games, the high school football team. And after 6 seasons, a complaint was raised at some point, and then the Bremerton School District decided to tell him to desist from engaging in prayer, and then because of his pushback against that and continuing to do so, or to wish to do so, it's now made its way all the way to the Supreme Court. So it's a sort of classic case of First Amendment, freedom of expression versus promotion or establishment of religion and so on. So we could circle around all the perhaps standard issues that we might circle around with this, but it's interesting just in the article that we'll be sharing, it is just the different ways in which it's described by opposing sides in the debate. Some of them say that, well, it's an individual stopping for 30 seconds to a minute at the side of a pitch. It's their own individual practice. They could just be picking up a contact lens, was what someone said. So, what's the problem with this? And that brings up all sorts of interesting questions about, what is it that makes it a prayer? And why is it problematic in that space? How do we know that this individual is praying? Or are they doing various symbolic actions that make it marked out as a prayer? Or what makes it different from going down on your knees to try and find a contact lens, right? So there's a lot of interpretation going on there. And there's the context as well. So as an individual with a position of power and in quite a visible public space engaging in this. So if they were doing it in the changing rooms or something, it would perhaps be different. But then on the flip side, there are groups, saying, yes, this individual has power. The players and so on will feel pressured, because sometimes people would join in. They'll feel pressured to join in if they don't subscribe to that. If the Satanic Temple attempted to do the same thing, which they threatened to do on the touchline as well, would that be as permitted, or is this because it is the locally hegemonic tradition that it is being allowed? So it throws up all sorts of issues, and perhaps worth saying that Donald Trump stepped in to say that he thought that it was absolutely fine and the guy should continue praying. So I don't know whether that would make you agree or disagree, but thoughts?
I think the Establishment Clause is also worth maybe talking about here, where public institutions can't establish religion in the United States. And so it's really interesting that, there's disagreement in this article between members of the community about whether or not this counts as the school district effectively establishing a religion or not, which I always find really interesting. As a state employee in the United States, you always got to be mindful in these public institutions of, describing and not prescribing, but those two things are quite related at times, perhaps not as clearly as they are in some ways they could be read in this article, right? So I thought that was interesting. I thought his saying that he heard God in the car ride home telling him what to do was an interesting moment. There's so many different parts of this that I think could be unpacked, and definitely, is it a collective, or is there a collective influence of this one person's ritual act, or is it an exterior manifestation of an interior state? Or are they just picking up a contact lens and it's a secular act, right? There's so many different layers to this entire situation. So this is a great article. Thanks for putting it up.
Because it's like what is at stake? Part of me just sort of bangs my head on the table and goes, who cares? What is this? What does it matter? This individual's doing that. It's not hurting anyone, not harming any. But then that's, from my perspective, where that is seen as not such a harmful act. But if it was another tradition with an ideology that was perhaps perceived as more threatening to the dominant social norm, that would make a difference as well. But also, what other ritual acts or norms are not being commented on here. Like as soon as the word religion is brought into it, then it becomes problematic. But in terms of, high school football teams, presumably there'll be, there might be cheerleaders involved here, and there's all sorts of norms and rituals and strange social practices that are being normalized with that. There'll be, for people in the team, there'll be appearance regimens and exercise regimens and honor codes and all sorts of things that they have to subscribe to. And of course, there's the national anthem and pledges of allegiance and all of that. And none of these are considered problematic. It's this one area that is singled out. And so just why is this being discussed at all? Raises questions.
Yeah, it was a great article. Thanks for sharing it also, Chris. I was also about to comment on what Sierra mentioned on that when the guy heard God and he felt compelled to go to and do the praying in the middle of the field. I don't know, immediately that kind of made me think about Tanya Luhrmann's theory of mind, or like how God becomes, and she conceptualizes as kindling. And actually, that's the part of the title of her latest book, How God Becomes Real. He mentions a little bit of his journey through Christianity and being a Marine, and then like watching this film, like Facing the Giants, I think, which is a Christian movie as well, in the context of football. So it kind of the guy convinced himself, or like he felt the calling of doing this kind of like a very short ritual of praying in the middle of the field. So it's like I think it's great part of course it's not discussed in depth in the article because it's not focus of it, but I think it's like this kind of everyday practices of prayer, and also to commend oneself to another entity or supernatural agent, so to speak, becomes effective, so much so that you can hear the voice of someone or something that compels you to make this kind of acts. And just this kind of like a very public display of praying in the middle of the field after a game is just a consequence of this kind of recurrent practices that happens in one's private life, and probably in the church setting as well. But I see that as that. So it's like kind of a consequence, but not a cause, so to speak. So it's interesting to see that it's so much alive, this kind of a really close relationship with what people think as God or spirits or things like that, which also you can see in many other religious settings. So with more emphasis, less emphasis, but it's there. I mean, it's part of human sociality and human condition. So yeah.
Yeah, and like you said, like what isn't being called into question as being normalized? Like I'd be curious to see, not genuinely, but just for the sake of conversation, if there's a local business, sponsoring their jerseys, and how that's, capitalism is never being questioned in these situations, just like sort of heteronormative kind of gender norms are pretty accepted in this space. So it's a really interesting example in many ways.
Good. I know, Sidney, time's coming up, but I'll just quickly comment on the other. So there's two little articles about Derry Girls. One's a letter to the editor, complaining about blasphemy in the program, the use of Jesus's name, frequently as a swear word, and the other is about the conspicuous lack of a British flag in a particular scene in a recent episode. So just for context, Derry Girls is broadcast on Channel 4 in the UK, but it's set in Derry / Londonderry in Northern Ireland. It'll depend which quote community unquote you come from, whether you call it Derry or Londonderry. And it's set during the 90s, so sort of towards the tail end of the Troubles, as we would euphemistically call it. Well, it's a comedy program. I would describe it as, if anyone's familiar with Father Ted, it's in a similar sort of headspace, I suppose, with a dominant Catholic Irish culture being quite irreverently treated, but in a way that is like, just from my own lived experience and lived experience of others from the island, is profoundly relatable and quite well studied and kind of warm at the same time. And what I feel that the program, both of those programs do, but we're talking about Derry Girls here, is Catholicism is there. It's a constant theme throughout, and the school's a Catholic institution with nuns doing the teaching and priests heavily involved and so on. Catholicism is really embedded in it, but it's not the focus. And it's clearly something that's not treated with massive amounts of respect, but also is at the same time. It's like a constant pressure, constant presence, but it's just part of life, which is what I really enjoy about it. And, whilst, yes, the language is foul to many ears, so it'll probably put some people off. It's incredibly enjoyable. So yes, but the letter to the editor was saying, but 20, 30 years ago, this wouldn't have been allowed on television with all this blasphemy and so on. And what does this say about our so-called Christian society and so on? Obviously, I don't know whether it's a real letter or a farcical letter. Who knows? But there were all those notions of, Christian nation in there. And I would say Derry Girls, with that complete embeddedness of it, and with the total threading through language of just using religious terminology in derogatory ways and so on, it is indicative of, it is depicting a time when Catholicism was, and indeed in some communities still is, highly embedded, and that is perhaps a more religious society than one that would balk at there being any use of Jesus Christ as a swear word on television. I don't know. I believe, Sierra, you've seen the program. How does it translate in your context?
I adore that program because, if this person's upset that they're using Jesus as a curse word, I don't know what they're going to think when dog urine is thought to be the tears of Mary coming down as a miracle. Like, this show is hilarious. And I honestly turned it on for the first time and thought it was contemporary because here it's streamed on Netflix, and they have, so much money that they have these like very overproduced characters most of the time that have, it's just an interesting, shows for binge watching have a little bit more of a different vibe here. So I didn't realize it was set in the 90s until maybe like 3 episodes in. And, I'm probably dozing off. And then once I started to understand what it was actually about and why the moms are having the conversations with the girls and kind of like just different things. There's one episode where they're with a boys' school and they're rock climbing, and anyways, none of that has to do with critically engaging with what you just put on the table, but it's just a great show. And if someone's not comfortable with Jesus's name being used in that way on the show, there's so many other great examples where I don't know that they watched the whole thing. They must have just been flipping through the channels and saw that part.
There'd be plenty more to be offended by. But yeah, it is just, as I say, it's the tail end of the Troubles, but it's the time when I was growing up in Northern Ireland, and it's just, regularly you would just be like, oh, we can't go down that road because there was a bomb. Okay, we'll go down this, and it was just so normalized that it didn't raise eyebrows. Regularly having your car stopped by armed police or army officers to inspect the car in case you were smuggling people or whatever and stuff was just normal. It's a complete world away, but the program does a good job of just making it a real context without any of that being at the forefront. So it's nice.
Right. Just reminded me a little bit of what controversies happened with one of my favorite shows, South Park, and it's, of course, in the United States, but also when we had the dubbed in Spanish, in Latin American Spanish, which I think it was done by a Venezuelan company. I mean, it was quite good. I mean, you cannot even the voice acting and the blasphemies were all over the place. Of course, very loyal to the source material, but they were only online on cable television, and few people had cable television when South Park, the dub version, was broadcasted in Peru at least. So end of 90s, early 2000s, and it just became massified later on. But yeah, it's and over there, of course, it's also blasphemy everywhere. I mean, they don't respect anyone. That's what makes it so fun. I imagine this is the case also with this program, but it just goes to how to show that yeah, I mean, you can make comedy of religion, and of course, people are going to be offended because it touches on values, kind of like outlooks, worldviews. But this letter was one case that I would expect to see something written towards South Park as well, because it mentions something about Judgment Day, and so yeah, what will we say on Judgment Day when we all have to appear before Him, before God, of course, blame someone else and say it was funny? Yeah, so that was like a kind of yeah, you can do so much with this small paragraph as well, just to comment on that and how these kind of deep entrenched values and or views are like react towards things that happen in the outside world. Yeah, it's like it was kind of a fun letter. It was short but sweet.
Good stuff.
Yeah, and I think in the U.S., Family Guy is the most well-known Protestant Catholic dynamic shown in a TV show, or that would be my guess. Like, there's really not much talk of diversity in Christianity, I don't think, in television in the United States. It's much more subtle. Like Lois in Family Guy is one of the only times that I can think that it's like emphasized throughout an animated TV show, for instance. Yeah.
Yeah. There was one episode, I think. Well, in Family Guy, I think there was this episode. No, it was an episode in South Park that were part of the Family Guy, and they were part of the fact that they were going to depict Prophet Muhammad in the cartoon, and it was such a mess. And even the Comedy Central had, which is the broadcasting company of South Park, had some like death threats and stuff. But in previous episodes of South Park, there was like a Super Best Friends episode, which were like all the prophets of world religions, or most of them. It was Jesus, Muhammad depicted properly, Lao Tzu, Joseph Smith from the Mormons, and and Aquaman for some reason. There was something like, yeah, and he had a sidekick that I cannot repeat his name, but just Google it. It's super fun episode, and it's like, yeah, I mean, yeah, religion wasn't depicted so bad. I mean, they were having fun. Just like, I think it depends on how you like, kind of, in which time also you release the episode, because this Family Guy part of the episode of South Park was after 9/11 and after this Danish cartoon terrorist attack. I don't know which year it was, but yeah, it was way later after that. So you cannot hurt those susceptibilities anymore. Yeah, so we like it was time really passed by really fast. So we set out to talk to some few topics, but that's how it goes with release studies scholars. We like to talk, especially if we are given the opportunity to do so, about a topic that we love or that we are working on. Not specifically what we are working on right now, but other things. It's more fun to talk about those things. But anyhow, I thank Chris and Sierra for being here in today's episode of Discourse at the RSP, and we hope that we have another chance to talk about these subjects and more. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sidney.
Bye-bye.
The RSP is sponsored by the BASR, NAASR and the IAHR and is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation. Find out more at religiousstudiesproject.com.
Brought to you by editors Andy Alexander and David McConaughey and founding editors Chris Cotter and David Robertson. Our features are edited by Savannah Finver and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bach. Audio editing by Alex Matthews, video editing by Alison Isidore, podcast transcription by Jaden Bartasius, and social media managed by Candice Mixon.
Don't forget, you can support the project by using our amazon.com, .co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, iTunes, and all other portals. Thanks for listening.